West Coast person. Welcome. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you to our webinar all about literacy assessments for older striving readers. Thanks for coming. I'm Melanie McDermott. I'm the Director of Marketing here at StoryShares, and I will be your host this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're zooming in from. First up, I'm just going to give you a little overview of what to expect from today's webinar. I'm going to go through an introduction, a couple of logistics about what to expect, and then I'll introduce our panelists for today. Then we will have plenty of time for a really awesome panel discussion, and then a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A and a quick closing. Just one thing to note for logistics, we would love for you to be active in the chat. Since we can't see your faces or hear your voices, we still want to be able to interact with you. And the chat is a great way to do that. So we encourage you to be talking to each other, talking to us, asking questions. The chat goes to everyone who's here, the panelists, anyone who registered, anyone who's attending, can see the chat. And then the Q&A just goes to the panelists. So if you have like a specific question, put it in the Q&A. If you just want to like talk about something, chit chat, ask a general question, you can put it in the chat. Okay. Now, just wanted to give you a little bit of background about StoryShares. If you're new to StoryShares, welcome. StoryShares is a literacy organization that was founded by our CEO, Louise Bagelman, who you'll meet soon, about 10 years ago when she was a middle school teacher who realized that she didn't have any books for her students who were still working on foundational reading skills. So she started creating those books herself, and StoryShares was born. At StoryShares, we know that literacy is not a finish line that's reached by grade 3. It's a lifelong journey. So our mission is to change the world through stories by creating engaging, compelling, relevant content and resources for striving readers in grades 3 and up. Before I introduce our panelists, we're just going to do a quick poll, if I can pull it up, so we can just see who is out there. And okay, polls. Which age group do you work with? Okay, hopefully that popped up on everyone's screen. Which age group do you work with? You can give it a quick answer. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of middle school, a lot of mixed age group. Oh, it's fun to see it change as everyone puts in their answer. I'll give it like 10 more seconds. Okay, a lot of people are saying they work with a mixed age group of students or other, and then middle school. All right. I'll share the results so everyone can just see sort of who's out there in the audience today. All right. And then we will get started with our panelist introductions. Hi, I'm Melanie. I already introduced myself, but just a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Marketing here at StoryShares. I am a former kindergarten teacher. I taught kindergarten in Boston Public Schools for over a decade, and I'm so excited to be sort of bridging early literacy and secondary literacy in my role here at StoryShares. And next up, our moderator for today's webinar is Louise Bagelman. And Louise, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. So you already gave a little of my backstory, but it's great to meet you. I'm Louise. I started StoryShares after I, had an experience in the classroom working with middle school newcomers and felt like there had to be a better way to support older students along their literacy journey. And so started StoryShares as a way to think about initially just the books differently, but now the instruction, intervention, and curriculum differently for the students that have gotten beyond third grade but are still learning to read. So I will be moderating and excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you and welcome. Next up, we have Dr. Mary Schrader, who is joining us from the Achievement Network. Mary, you can introduce yourself.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Schrader, and I'm the Director of Literacy at the Achievement Network, otherwise known as ANET. And I've been in education for over 20 years now. I was a high school and middle school ELA teacher for over 12 years. And then I was a professor of teacher education. And now at ANET, I wear a whole bunch of different hats. I lead ANET's national partnership with Stanford University on their rollout of the ROAR Foundational Skills Assessment. I also am helping to build our new ELA literacy assessment suite, and I support our coaches and I support system leaders across the country with helping their striving readers. So, very excited to be here today.
Amazing. We're so glad that you're here. Thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Dr. Liz Norton, who is a literacy leader, a coach, a policy expert. What doesn't she do? Tell us more about you, Liz.
Yeah, I'm Liz Norton. I am the founder of Incessantly Relentless Leadership. I formerly worked for the Tennessee Department of Education, where I led several large-scale initiatives, including our Read to Be Ready coaching network, which was 250 coaches across the state working to improve early literacy. I then led all of our direct-to-district support in literacy, math, special education, CTE, and data analysis, particularly focusing on our rollout of high quality instructional materials, K-12, in both literacy and math. And now I support district, state, schools, organizations in sort of bridging that, making the bridge between research, policy, and practice. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. We're so glad you're here. Next, we have Danielle Ortolani, who is a middle school special educator. Go ahead, Danielle.
Hi, I am a middle school special educator. I've been working in suburban schools outside of Boston since 2010. Mostly, I started off doing a lot of inclusion in ELA and math classes, and then I got certified in Wilson Reading Systems in 2021. And since then, I've had a big literacy focus. I've also had some training in Norton Gillingham through the Institute of Multisensory Education and Linda Mood Bell. I've also done some phonics editing and curriculum development at StoryShares.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Danielle. And we're so excited to have your perspective as a teacher who's actually in the classroom with students. So thank you for joining us today. And last but not least, our very own Shira Engel. Shira, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm Shira Engel. I am the Chief Academic Officer at StoryShares. I am also a dyslexia specialist and a former middle school humanities teacher. This is a quick plug for our literacy leadership webinar, which is coming up in October, but my first year of teaching middle school humanities, I was so surprised by the students in my class who were still working on sounding out single syllable words because I was not ready to teach them. And that was my pathway to becoming a dyslexia specialist. But it was also my school's pathway to really training up the teachers in MTSS and in data informed practices. So this work for everyone is deeply personal, and I think that that this assessment piece, and I'm so excited to talk more about it today, is a huge part of why I ended up at StoryShares as well. It was my pathway into teaching not just literature, but foundational literacy as well. I'm happy to be here.
So glad you're here. So glad you joined us. Okay, before we kick things off with our panel discussion, have just a couple more questions just to see what everyone's hoping to get out of this webinar today. So, two quick questions. One, do you have an assessment that you feel like you can use with older students? Let's see how people are feeling about that. Okay, I'm seeing some yeses, some no's, and a lot of yes, but okay, that's what we expected. Okay, a lot of people saying yes, but great. Well, then you're in the right place because we have so much to share today. Okay, I'm going to end that one. Just give you a quick peek at the results. And then last question is, how do you feel about the if you have an assessment that you can use, how do you feel about it? Is it great? Is it meh, could be better? Or like Please, please help me. This is horrible. It's not working. Okay, lots of could be betters. It gets the job done. Some people are saying it's great. That's excellent. Some people are saying, please help. We're here to help. Okay. Okay. So a lot of people are in the middle. It's like, I have some assessments, it's okay. But it might not do everything that I need it to do or give me all the data that I need. I'll just show you that. Could be better. Okay, cool. That's great to know. And now, without further ado, I will pass the mic over to our moderator, Louise.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, that was insightful early poll responses. So to kick off this first question, we want to hear from our panelists. What are some challenges you have seen or encountered when it comes to assessing teens' literacy skills? And we use teens sort of loosely. It's basically like preteens through adults. When it comes to assessing literacy skills beyond that typical age of focus for literacy, so third grade and up, and what solutions have you come up with? So for this question, I'm going to start by asking Danielle, and then we can jump on with additional thoughts from there.
Thanks. So some of the challenges that I've faced is that by the time kids get to us in middle school, they have learned to mask a lot of their difficulties. They don't want to seem like they don't know something in front of their peers, so they find ways to kind of just get through text, whether they're relying on memorization or they're using some of those visual or contextual clues to kind of get through some readings. And then another one that I've encountered is that a lot of the assessments are, if they're looking at reading, they don't always get into the foundational level skill set. So a lot of middle school assessments, if it's geared towards middle schoolers, they don't really look in detail at their phonics skills, their phonemic awareness. They're more looking at the comprehension and the vocabulary development. So it really is hard to sometimes, if you don't have that data, to be able to realize which kids need some more foundational support. And I've working with my middle schoolers, sometimes they kind of get a little frustrated with working on some of those basics when we're doing our letter sound cards, and they're get frustrated. I know my ABCs, I don't need to do this. And kind of my big thing, the way I overcome this obstacle for all of these is just they're middle schoolers. They're starting to be able to understand a little bit more. Is I just like to explain to them how complex reading is, and that it's not just something that you pick up and that you acquire. Oral language, it's a societal skill that we learn, whereas reading, there are so many things that go into reading. So you need to be able to utilize all of those skills, having all the language comprehension skills, but also being able to pick apart the words and be able to understand what each of those letters say, so that you can decode the words that you encounter in your reading.
Yeah, I love that. As far as, one of the powers of working with older students is you can explain things to them as, other humans that are able to comprehend on a higher level, and sometimes that makes them feel more seen and heard. And I'm eager to hear what everyone else has to say, but I also like that you mentioned the complexity of assessing older students when it comes to what we're assessing, because for little kids, my kids who are in early elementary school, it's more aligned with where they are and what they're supposed to be learning, and therefore what we're assessing. But there's this decoding threshold that comes in when we're assessing reading in those older grades, where we're asking for their comprehension, and we know that if they can't decode, their comprehension will be precisely 0. And so how do you sort of segment all those pieces out? So yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I think that decoding threshold is actually also part of the challenge, right? So not only do you have the decoding skills from early grades, so those foundational skills, but the application of those skills gets more difficult over time with multisyllabic words and Greek and Latin roots and some of those pieces that also come into play. And so understanding where the breakdown is happening can be really challenging for our striving adolescent readers, because it could be in any number of things. It could be in the decoding space, it could be in the vocabulary, it could be in the comprehension, it could be in the background knowledge that just didn't bring enough to this text. And then as we move into high school too, it could be in the disciplinary application of it, right? So the way that we read in science is different than the way that we read in our ELA classes when we're looking at literary text. And so the breakdown could be happening in any number of places. And so when we think about assessment in particular, if we're assessing in that comprehension or we're assessing for standards, sometimes it can sort of miscue us to what the potential solutions are if we're not really digging into where the underlying problems are.
Liz, that's such a good point. And I think about it as like when students are younger, the gap or the struggles they're having with reading could be more of like a crack. And then by the time they get to their teenage years, it's like a canyon, right? And we have to figure out like what exactly is it where they're struggling? And I wanted to add to the list that you just said because I think we also have to think about self-efficacy and motivation and reader identity because I think that's a part of the canyon too. By the time that students are taking this assessment, they've felt like a poor reader or a struggling reader, for years and years, and that could be baked into their identity as a student, which then they come to the assessment, they're not engaged. They're not going to try. They're defeated before they even arrive. And so I think that's an important aspect of making sure that when we put assessments in front of our teens, it's appropriate for them. It's respectful of the level that they're at, and it gets them excited to want to learn and read, and doesn't defeat them from the beginning.
And I also think an accurate assessment along those lines really focuses on strengths as well as areas for growth. And I think, Danielle, something that you initially said um, really stuck out to me, which is like they have this older students have they have an identity, a reader identity already, and in so many ways that is informed by the assessments they have already taken. And Mary, to your point, that identity is part of that canyon, and it's part of it can be full of gaps that they feel like they have, but if the assessment I think is good enough, it also shows them where their strengths lie. And I often think about the practicum student that I worked with when I was getting my dyslexia practitioner certification, and he did not, I had no idea that his comprehension skills were through the roof. Like he had phenomenal comprehension skills, but because he was assessed often without a human reader, or he was assessed based on essentially that decoding threshold. Um, and so I did not know that he had tremendous vocabulary strengths. I had a hunch from conversation, but I didn't have data to prove that. And he had really phenomenal comprehension skills, but all the assessment told me was that he could not decode to the point of showing those skills. And so I think that um, I mean, one solution like lies within kind of having a universal screener and then individual diagnostics and but I think there are so many layers there, and providing accommodations for assessments that are being offered whole schools so that those strengths can be noticed. Um, but yeah, even as I say that, I think through the kind of all the gaps in those approaches, and how there aren't often assessments that can really tell us a full story, and a real narrative about a student and their experiences and their identities and their history with reading, and with being assessed on their reading, which can often have its own, it can come with its own baggage in addition to their ideas about reading.
Yeah, I love that you all went there because, this webinar is obviously about assessments in particular, but it's one of the really crucial nuances that goes into older students, mastering literacy skills is that it's very different from a kindergartner learning to read and being assessed for reading, where they don't have any baggage. There's no emotional weight or negativity or identity around, I'm just not a reader, or reading, it's not something I'm good at. Reading's not for me. They already have some of those negative associations, not just with reading, but with being tested for it because they don't feel good about that. So, yeah, being able to show progress and being able to actually assess what they know versus it's one of the challenges. It's why it's trickier in those older grades. So, great. Well, thank you all for your very insightful responses there. So, for the next question, question two, what should teachers, interventionists, and school leaders look for in a literacy assessment when it comes to older striving readers? And, how does this maybe differ from how we address this when it comes to younger readers? So for this question, I'm going to have Liz kick it off.
Yeah, I think Shira, you really started to hit on it. And that's that for one, we need to make sure we have more than one assessment, right? There's not one perfect assessment that's going to work for all of our kids. And so having both that universal screener, but also having, I would say, a suite of diagnostic options, right? We want to make sure that we can really dig in where each individual student might be struggling. And so when we think about sort of what to look for in a literacy assessment, one, we want to make sure that we have tools that are going to help us uncover those deficits. So assessments that span all the different things that we already talked about in terms of phonics and decoding, vocabulary comprehension. But for that phonics and decoding piece, we want to be looking at both the foundational skills, but also that application into advanced phonics. And so really making sure we're understanding the suite of gaps that could exist. And again, that's going to mean we're going to need more than one assessment, and we're going to need to look at those assessments through the lens of the students that we're serving.
Perfect. Yeah, 100% agree, which is, I'm interested in like versus elementary school, what we have that works there and where some of that tends to break down for the older grades. But yeah, Mary or Shira or Danielle, anything to add to that?
Yeah, Liz, that was a great kickoff. And something that I wanted to add to that, which is that we know in the older grades we don't have a lot of assessments that actually assess foundational skills for our older students. That this is something that Danielle was talking about earlier. And so what I've noticed in the schools and districts I've worked in is that either leaders and teachers use a foundational skills assessment that is at the elementary level, or they're using a comprehension screener and then flagging kids from that for more support for foundational skills. Neither of those are the right way to go, right? And so, what you want to look for, and again, like I said, there's only a couple of assessments out there that do this, but they should be validated and reliable for our older readers. Because if you're using an assessment that is not meant for that grade level, the data isn't actually super trustworthy. You risk putting kids into the wrong interventions, or you could even be missing some kids that actually do need support. So making sure it's validated. And like I said earlier, make sure it's appropriate. If it has gamification and, bubbly letters and cartoons, it's not going to be right for our students. So, I know that I'm going to talk about it later, but ROAR is one of those assessments validated for older students. CAPD is another, and hopefully we'll talk about a few others that are good assessments for foundational skills for our older students.
Perfect. Yeah. Finding not just the challenges, but also what works is a key piece of this puzzle. So, yeah, Shira or Danielle, anything to add before we move on to the next question?
I don't have anything to add here. I think that those examples are really, really helpful. And I think that overall, just to echo what folks have already said, looking at just like we look at lessons with objectives, I think we also have to look at assessments with objectives and looking at what is that assessment trying to, what kind of data are we trying to get from it? And almost backwards planning from there and finding the assessment that meets that objective. can be really helpful because there are different objectives for assessing students depending on so many different factors, and particularly for older students.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we talk about a lot at Story Shares is, how do we bridge the intervention side of things with the core curriculum and grade level standards. And so, thinking about the fact that the students have to take these standardized tests that are at grade level, and those give a slice of the picture, but how do we start to like connect all the dots so that we're not misassessing through those, but instead supplementing it with real informative information. So, yeah, we'll move on to question 3. And you started touching on this a little bit, Mary, but I'll let you go deeper to kick this one off. What are some examples of assessments that do give useful data to help inform instruction in foundational literacy, specifically for older students?
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this because this has been the greater portion of my work over the past 2.5 years, which is that in my role and in my organization, we were like, we really need an assessment for our older readers because we were seeing a lot of interest from districts across the country to get support for their older students and their literacy skills. And so we went searching and we found the Rapid Online Assessment of Reading, which is ROAR, which was developed by a neuroscience lab out of Stanford University. And so I've been working with them, and I've been bringing ROAR to districts and schools across the country. And there are a couple of things that make ROAR pretty impactful. One is that it's fully online. So if you have a school of like 3,000 students, you could assess them all at the exact same time, which is amazing. It's really quick, depending how many subtests you have your students take. It can take between 20 to 30 minutes, and it's validated K through 12, which is really rare to find. And we know a lot of foundational skills tend to be one-on-one. The foundational skills assessments tend to be given one-on-one, and they stop at elementary. So that's why ROAR is pretty amazing. And I don't know if you all saw the most recent NAEP data that came out earlier this month, but it was showing the lowest 12th grade reading scores ever recorded from that assessment. And so even though foundational skills assessments tend to end at like 6th and 8th grade, we know all the way through high school there are students still struggling with foundational skills, and we've got to figure out which students those are, which is why ROAR is so great. And so we use ROAR for kind of two big levers. We use their word assessment for decoding and their sentence assessment for fluency. And y'all have already talked about the decoding threshold, but it's essentially a level at which a student needs to be able to decode words in order to understand what they're reading. And so what's cool about ROAR is it will tell you the exact students who are below the decoding threshold, meaning they need specific and explicit decoding support and intervention, which is great. And then we also look at fluency. And what we've found with the fluency assessment from ROAR is that like around 80% of the students we assess in schools need some type of fluency support. And so I think a lot of teachers have been really shocked by that. And then from there, we can get students the support that they need for both decoding and fluency. And just to give you a quick example, we work in a charter school system in Baltimore. And in one of the schools, ROAR identified 35 students who were below the decoding threshold. And within 3 weeks, those students were given follow-up diagnostics. They were placed in a daily intervention. So the movement by leadership in that school was super quick. And then the school also realized through ROAR that the school in general needed morphology support. And so they embedded a morphology routine in their tier 1 classes, and then kind of did a double dose of that in their tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. And what we saw in that first year was a huge amount of growth actually on both decoding and fluency. And teachers also said they noticed a shift in students too, like they were gaining confidence in their reading because of this work that we were doing. So it's really cool to see that progress, and it's really cool to have an assessment that helps us in this way and then shows us the growth that students are making over time.
Great, perfect. And I can't remember, but Roar does those initial pieces that are missing from the larger, puzzle. And then you have to pair it with something for comprehension. Is that right? Because yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So some of the subtests are phonemic awareness, letter sounds, decoding fluency, morphology, and vocabulary. And they're constantly adding more subtests to it. But yeah, comprehension would have to be a different assessment. This is just for foundational skills.
Yeah, it's those hidden pieces that a lot of the kind of typical assessments for older students are missing. So, if anyone else has anything, and also Shira, I know that we see a lot of this fluency, you know, component as a gap in our work too. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, just the fluency piece of the puzzle and how it inhibits decoding from getting to comprehension sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that framing of how it inhibits decoding from getting to comprehension because I worked with a literacy specialist once who used to say that morphology is the only way to teach decoding and comprehension at the exact same time. And what I will say about fluency is that it is when I think fluency is another example of that, where we are teaching decoding and comprehension at the exact same time when we are explicitly teaching fluency. And I've seen that with students just as much, if not more so, in conjunction with morphology. But with fluency is particularly for older students, but in general, we're looking at rate, accuracy, and reading with prosody or expression. And like Danielle mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, older students often come with a lot of compensatory strategies that they've learned over the years of being students who have been faced with reading tasks more so than a very, very beginning reader. And so when it comes to fluency, they might be compensating in certain ways. So a good assessment is going to be really diagnostic and see, okay, they're really accurate readers, which means they have mastered in some way, they've mastered the decoding piece, but they are not reading with any expression. They're not paying attention to punctuation while they read, and that will give some um, that will give some data that can then inform instruction. And the reverse is also true. Students can be really focused on reading rate and kind of zoom through, and their accuracy can suffer, and that's not fluent reading either. Um, and so really looking at all the different components of that. And I think that with older students, one of the big challenges there is that they've learned ways to get really strong in one area, and it can be so important to figure out what that area is. But a strength in one part of fluency is not fluency. And so I think also really working on using data to figure out what needs to be built up.
Yeah, and if you think about it, if you read a sentence where you pause in the wrong places and there's a question mark at the end, but you don't use that inflection in your voice, it actually it sounds totally different and the meaning is different. And so fluency is like, how do you string those words together so that you can make meaning of them, which is what comprehension really is. And it requires that and also vocabulary background knowledge to get there. And it requires decoding at an automaticity. That means you're not spending all of your mental energy on figuring out how the letters form words, but being able to sort of string them together and make meaning of them from there. So, yeah. Any other comments? Yeah, Danielle, on this question before we move
I
on.
think it's also important in terms of um, having the words, the content be something geared towards older students, because one of the compensatory strategies is that they've memorized so many words. They've turned like hundreds, thousands of words into sight words. And I feel like that's something that has helped them not get picked up for some of these reading challenges so far. And so having the word lists and the words that we're having them decode be words that aren't as familiar to them and that they actually do need to use their decoding strategies, and they aren't something that they've filed away in their memorized word bank.
Totally. I already see that with my first grader. It's like she knows birthday and, you know, happy, right? And so, but then there are other words where it's like you need the code to then uncover them. It's not actually a strength to be able to guess at the word. Okay, so any final thoughts before we move on to question 4? There we go. So formative assessment. What are some bite-sized ways that literacy educators and interventionists can weave assessment into their instruction? And, I know that for those of you that are teachers, there are a lot of challenges when it goes into assessing an entire class of students. So, ROAR has, I think the first R is rapid, right? So that idea of bite-sized, but Shira, you can open this one up with how do you sort of use this and iterate on it as you go?
I could talk about this for forever, but I'm going to keep it very concise because I think that everyone who has been in the classroom has their own way of doing this, and those can often be very unique. So I would love to hear what other folks think and have done. My favorite way to do this is to annotate lesson plans, and really rigorously annotate lesson plans as I am teaching. And then to have that not only as an artifact for the next time I teach that lesson, but also to have that student data that comes from seeing what parts of the lesson a student is mastering. And this is particularly useful for intervention where structured literacy skills are often segmented. So seeing what parts of the lesson a student has some level of mastery in, or competency in, and then what parts of a lesson they might still be struggling with. And I will often use student initials when I'm annotating so that I can take those really quick notes. So those annotated lesson plans I think are huge. And then they can also inform not just instruction for the next time that you teach that lesson, but I think that a really good annotated lesson plan informs the next lesson that is taught. So if a student is inaccurate with a word that they are reading, I am going to weave that word into the next lesson so that they get another at bat with that. If we are working on, if we're alternating between working on rate, accuracy, and reading with expression, and I notice that they need more time with focusing on reading with expression because of a note that I made in that lesson plan, the following day we're not going to move on to the next one, even if that's what the lesson plan says. We're going to differentiate the lesson plan to really meet that need that was annotated previously. So I think annotating a lesson plan is one of my favorite ways to do that. And then I think just to speak to the overwhelm that can often come when working with older students because of, in large part, because of class size. When I taught middle school humanities, I had 90 students. Like I was, they were coming in and out of my classroom and I was trying to get student data. And when I was doing that in a formative way, I had one principal who had us walk around with a clipboard and have the objectives segmented out into skills, and like write a check mark next to the student name when I saw them show that skill. But when I was doing that, I kind of felt like I was focusing on quantity over quality. And so the middle ground that I think can be really powerful. And I actually learned this from Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. She does this with a lot of her student teacher rapport protocols, but I think this can also be done academically, is to choose 5 students in every lesson that you observe and to alternate. So it's not the same 5 every time, but you are hitting those same 5 multiple times in like a quarter or a trimester of instruction. And to really just focus on those 5 per lesson and to take notes on objective observations. So to not think necessarily about what are the implications for my teaching, but just what am I noticing? So I'm not even going to student struggles with blends. That's not an objective observation. An objective observation can be student wrote neck instead of next. Or students said neck instead of next. And so that is a piece of data that I'm getting on that student that I can then, if I notice a pattern, form some kind of a conclusion and be a little scientific about it. So I can then think, okay, what are the instructional implications here that I can then that can then inform the next lesson or the next unit. And so I think alternating that as well. And then I think there's another protocol. I love protocols. There's another protocol called noticings, wonderings, and implications, where it's a chart, and you're writing down what you notice in the class. You can write down what you notice about those 5 students, or you could choose just one student to do this with. And you're just writing down the noticings, and then you're just writing down the wonderings. And then after that student leaves, you can write down, okay, what are the implications for my instruction here? Um, and I think that that really does, for me at least, that gave me so much more data than the assumptions, than like the quick assumptions that I would make about students, because sometimes those assumptions in the moment are a reflection of something else, and I wouldn't, yeah. So anyways, those are some quick bite-sized ways.
Love that. I love the separating out so that you're not sort of making assumptions you don't realize in the moment.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else to add to the formative assessment question here from the other panelists? All right. Yeah, Sherry covered it very thoroughly. So question 5. How can educators use assessment data to inform their instructional practices? And Shira obviously touched on this. I think we've touched on this, actually, several of you have in different ways. But, as we get near the end of this webinar, when it comes to concrete takeaways, quick wins, but also deeper goals, how can educators leverage assessments for their teaching? So for this one, I think, Mary, I will have you start.
All right. Thanks, Louise. So I think we have touched on this a lot, which is awesome. And I think, a big takeaway from this panel is that data really should never be collected just for the sake of data, right? It should always impact the instruction of our students. And so I think there are 3 kind of big things we've talked about for ways that data can impact instruction. One is that we should use data to identify who needs support, first of all. Second, we should figure out what skills to target for that support. And then lastly, we should use data to strengthen tier 1 instruction. And for 1 and 2, identifying and figuring out what skills to support, that can be done as well with our intervention teachers and also with differentiation. But we also need to figure out like what we need to do in tier 1 to make sure that all of our students are getting the support that they need. And so, going back to the ROAR example that I was talking about, when we can see overall data for our students and our classes, that's going to help us like hone in on what we need to focus on. So if it's decoding, if you're like, my class really needs help with advanced decoding, then we get a morphology routine and we embed it into our daily lessons. If we're using a high quality instructional material, sometimes morphology and vocabulary routines are already embedded in. But if they're not, we find one that works and we embed it into our lessons. And same goes for fluency. If our students need support with fluency, if you embed a 10-minute fluency routine 3 times a week with the grade level text you're already using in the classroom, you are going to see improvement. For example, Study Sync. I don't know how many of you out there use Study Sync. It's a high school curriculum. They actually do a lot around close reading. It's a regular routine that they have in the curriculum. And they have fluency routines that go along with the close reading. So it's things like teacher modeling what they read, echo reading. So the teacher reads and then the students read it back to the teacher, or even choral reading where everybody reads at the same time together. And that builds students' fluency skills, and it also helps the teacher formatively assess because they can hear where things are off or where certain students are mispronouncing. So it works in both of those ways. And when we've done that specifically with fluency routines, again, like we've seen great progress in our students more than they would have had if we didn't embed that type of routine in place. So I think that focusing on that tier one instruction is where we're going to see a lot of progress for students.
Yeah, I love that. That's one of the things we talk about a lot is rigor. Yeah. And intervention. And intervention is in service of rigor. It's not at odds with rigor. And so how do you look at tier one and make sure we're not assessing students for the wrong things and assuming they don't know things that they do know, but figuring out what are those pieces that you can tackle in a bite-sized way to get them to be able to show all that they know and their strengths, as Shira mentioned. So, yeah, Shira, Liz, Danielle, anything to add to the role of assessment in instructional practices? Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I think I'd piggyback just on what you just said, and that is to also be careful that you're not taking assessment and using it to reteach something that isn't actually the problem, right? We can reteach main idea over and over again, but if the underlying problem was related to coding or related to background knowledge, it's not going to help. So just making sure that we're really digging in to understand where the breakdown occurred, and then that we're making that adjustment to support the breakdown and not just to reteach the standard over and over.
Yeah. Love that. And it's funny because my students actually could decode and read fluently, but then when you ask them what was that about, they'd be like, I don't know, no clue. And so in that case, if I were to then drill down on decoding, they'd be bored out of their minds, right? And so being able to differentiate those things and know, okay, they need more metacognition. They need more practice in thinking while they're reading and making meaning of the text, and they need stronger background knowledge to be able to piece it all together. So yeah, 100% agree. Danielle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, to follow up on what all of you were saying is that the groupings are so important and making sure that they're skill-based and not based on who's available during which block and who's in what grade level and their overall grade level. Really drill down to what those specific skills are. And then also bringing it back to the student. Again, we have these older students, they're able to understand a little bit. So show them their assessment, show them this is where your strength is, this is the areas you need to improve, and work with the students so that they can be a part of setting those goals. So that they can, and then as you try to achieve those goals, both short and long term, celebrate all of the little successes, show them that you're proud of them. They can be proud of themselves. We can work to kind of build back that confidence that has been lost after struggling for so long and so many years, and just being able to break through some of those barriers by celebrating the successes that they do achieve, so that they can and then that will help motivate them to make more progress, and then the growth can just keep going from there.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, assessments allow us to understand where to hone in for instructional purposes, but also they give us the tools and the language to allow students to celebrate their own progress, to provide visible progress for these students who need it, because sometimes they're not feeling that. If they're struggling with reading in those grades, they are more used to feeling a lack of progress than that sensation of progress that never goes away. Like as adults, we want the same thing. So yeah, love that. All right, so we are down to the last 10 minutes, and this last question is for anyone on the panel and also anyone out there. We can't say see you, but you can use the chat I know that there was a range of responses to the poll around, like some people said great. And so certainly those of you who did, like share your tips. What are, great assessments to use for older students? What tips do you have for making that really relevant and useful? For those who said, good-ish or whatever we qualified it as, what has worked and how have you made it work? So, panelists, any thoughts? But in the meantime, to those participating, we'd be eager to hear anything you can share as well.
I mean, I think the biggest tip I have is just to organize it in a way that makes sense for you, that helps you build the habits of reflecting on the data you're collecting and using it to make instructional decisions. Because it's that habit that's really going to help you support your students, but it has to be a manageable habit. And that management system is going to be unique to you. So make it yours.
Love that. 100%. Yeah. Thank you, Liz. Chat's still open, but any other panelists with thoughts on this piece? Okay.
I think the thing that I would recommend is use the data to group your students with the type of support that they need. And I know we've mentioned this before, but differentiation is so important. And so if you know that there are specific skills that different groups of people need, making sure that you're able to make those groups, get the students the support in the time that they need it in. So invite people into your classroom. If you have other people around the school that have some free time, even if it's the principal, have them come in, have them work with different groups of your students. And I don't think we make use of this enough in secondary. We're always very contained in our classroom. We do a lot of whole group teaching or like maybe students in groups working with each other, but sometimes we're not as specific about getting certain students into groups to work on what skills, whether it's advanced decoding or fluency or background knowledge or vocabulary. So that would be my recommendation.
Love that you said that. Yeah.
And I think when it comes to assessing foundational skills, it can be very challenging sometimes for teachers of older students whose background might not be in those foundational skills to know how to use that assessment data to group students into intervention, if they have not yet had that training or if they are still going through that training. And in that case, and this is, I know of, I feel like every intervention program that I have heard of and that I have worked with has phenomenal, and I don't even want to call it this, but like phenomenal customer service slash implementation support. Like they want you to implement the program with fidelity, and that begins with assessment. I know we feel this way about our program at Story Shares. I know a lot of other programs feel this way. And I have called hotlines before. And I've been like, how I have a student who got this score on the universal screener, this score on the secondary diagnostic. What lesson do I start them at? What sub-step do I start them at? Like, I think taking advantage of that, like when I see like an info number, I often write it off as irrelevant, but I actually think that these are highly, highly relevant.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about at Story Shares is, when you sign up to be a middle school or high school teacher, like you typically expect to teach literature, not literacy. And so it's sort of this whole new startling challenge when you have students who can't read and so they can't, do the literature stuff that you had worked so hard to plan and had been trained in. You have to teach literacy and no one taught us, right, how to teach foundational literacy skills. And so, yeah, I mean, I like the hotline idea, but to Shira's point, there are a lot of resources that I know several across us panelists are working to develop to support those teachers, knowing that, you're not alone. It's 2/3 of fourth and eighth graders who are struggling with, and 12th graders with those skills. And so how do we fill those gaps when it comes to foundational literacy? And I love the small group thing too, because I often say, like, I think sometimes small group, reading groups became loaded with some of the science of reading movement and the way we were using them before, the leveled reading and Founders and Pinnell. But small groups, book groups are an ageless and endlessly powerful approach, and they just have to be structured the right way, where it's like, what are the students struggling with? And so they should be a tool that are leveraged for this instruction. So great. I know we only have 4 minutes. Mel, I'm probably supposed to wrap it up. So yeah.
Yes, it pains me to end this conversation, but we do have a really great question in the Q&A that I would love for the panelists to answer if we can quickly in the next 3 to 4 minutes. Someone asked, how can we frame the assessments to students without causing anxiety while also encouraging them to do their best?
Oh, and as you think about that, I noticed that Leslie also made a recommendation, which I don't know about. Maybe some of you do. Brain-friendly reading, nonsense word screener. So just to call that out too.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I said.
How can we frame the assessments to students without causing anxiety, but also encouraging them to do their best?
Great.
I like to talk about them as brain puzzles and kind of explaining to them that we can use our decoding skills to break down words and to think about the different pieces and how they go together, and kind of thinking of it as more of a puzzle than a reading skill. Kind of sometimes might make it a little bit more interesting, but that definitely is a challenge that we face with older students.
Yeah, I love the puzzle framing.
I also think just leveling with students, they're older, they know, they know that they are having a hard time with reading. They know they've been through the system, right? They get it. And so even just saying to them, like, I know you've taken a lot of these assessments before, and this time around, I'm going to use it to help figure out what you need to work on so that you can succeed in life. When you're done with school and when you're in college or in your career. And I also think going back to a point Shira made at the very beginning as well, saying also it's going to tell me what you're doing really great at. So we can leverage that for your benefit. And that's why I really like working with older students is because you can talk to them like on that level. And I think when you're just honest and open with students, they tend to will trust you and be more motivated and willing to do the work.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful note to end on, unless anyone else has any burning thoughts, because we talk a lot about how much harder it is to teach reading beyond third grade and how much more expensive it is, and how ideally we get them where they need to be by third grade. But there is a power to it too, which is like these students are, first of all, more resilient than most humans I know, and also really deeply aware. And so you can reason with them and you can talk to them and you can explain things to them. And that is one of the ways to open them up. So I love that as a final framing is like be real and also like help them see the power they have and how this will just elevate their potential. So thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. That's a beautiful, beautiful way to end. I wish we could keep going. If you do have any lingering questions, you can definitely email us. I think, oh, well, I'm going to skip this for a second. And here is everyone's emails and then the Story Shares emails on the next slide. But if there's anything that you want to follow up with any of our panelists about, here is their information. I'm also dropping in the chat a couple of links from Mary and Anat that could be used as resources or get some more information. Thank you, panelists, so much. I was loving just listening in on this conversation and learning so much. I wish we could have gone forever. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to very quickly plug our webinar. Shira mentioned at the beginning of our session today, but our webinar on October 16th is going to be a webinar for leaders, school leaders, anyone who is leading the way for literacy for older readers. We're going to have some principals and former principals coming on to have a panel discussion. So we would love for you to join us. You can register by scanning this QR code. And once again, huge thank you to our panelists. This was so much fun. It was amazing to learn from you. Thank you for joining us. And here is our Story Shares information. Stay in touch. We love to hear from you. Reach out. I see a couple of things happening in the chat. So thank you.
I just put mine and Shira's personal emails too, in case anyone wants
Excellent.
to email.
Excellent. All right. Thank you everyone so
Thank
much
you.
and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.